Hello Mishpacha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother. Welcome back to my channel. I'm here today with a Friday Reads video because it's Friday, so it's time for Friday Reads. So I finished this past week 3 books, and I'm currently reading, I think, 4 books, so let's go. So the first book I finished was Audre Lorde's Zami, A New Spelling of My Name. I did this as a buddy read with Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. And this is essentially a memoir or autobiography of Audre Lorde's life. The first half of it's largely centered on her childhood and adolescence, and then the second part of it recounts a number of significant sexual relationships with women that she had in her life. So overall, I ended up giving this book 3.25 stars. It's very straightforward in its account of things, and I would say that it's also kind of episodic in structure. There's not a lot of reflection in here, and that's really what I would like to see more when I read something like a memoir or an autobiography. Like, how do you contextualize these events now looking back on them? So I didn't like it as much as I really wanted to for that reason. It does get a bit more reflective toward the end. So for example, right before chapter 30, she writes, "It was a while before we came to realize that our place was the very house of difference rather than the security of any one particular difference, and often we were cowards in our learning. It was years before we learned to use the strength that daily surviving can bring, years before we learned fear does not have to incapacitate, and that we could appreciate each other on terms not necessarily our own." So moments like that I really liked in this text, but those were pretty few and far between. I also really would have liked to have heard more about the McCarthy era, because she indicates several times in here that she was active in protesting on behalf of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were convicted in the United States in 1953 of being of treason and of spying for communists, and they were executed it was on June 19th of 1953, I believe. And like I said, Lorde talks about how she was active in protest against the execution of the Rosenbergs, and I kind of would have liked to have heard more about that and about kind of the rise of the McCarthy era as well. So yeah, so it's fine. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you just like really want to know everything about Audre Lorde's life, or if you just like a memoir or autobiography that's very straightforward and doesn't have like a ton of reflection, then I would recommend it too. But I mean, I'm still glad that I read it because now I know more about her life than I did before, so 3.25 stars. The next book I finished, I've actually already posted a full review. This was Richard Wright's new novella, previously unpublished, The Man Who Lived Underground. I posted this. This was the last video I posted. I posted it on Wednesday. I will link that down below. And I filmed a standalone review of this book. One, because I had kind of more things I wanted to say about it than in just like a regular sort of 3 to 4 minute wrap up during a Friday Reads video or whatever. But also because I actually I tried to search within BookTube to see if anybody had done a review of this book, and I couldn't find any. So at least as of Wednesday, I was the only person who had posted a review of this book, which was kind of shocking to me because the fact that Richard Wright has had a previously unpublished manuscript published is kind of a big deal. So, anyway, so I will leave a link to that down below if you want to watch that full review, but I like this quite a bit overall, although I will say that so it contains the novella and it contains an essay that Wright specifically wrote to go with the book, which is called Memories of My Grandmother, and the essay I liked quite a bit more than the novella, and it swayed me to a higher rating than I probably would have given the book otherwise, but I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then the last book that I finished this week was Aiiieeee, an anthology of Asian American writers, 3rd edition. So this is edited by Frank Chin, Jeffrey Paul Chan, Lawson Fusao Inada, and Sean Wong. So this is the 3rd edition of this book. It was originally published in 1974. It then went through a 2nd edition called The Big Aiiieeee in 1991. It was very influential text and very groundbreaking text when it came out, because it was one of the first, if not the first, book to discuss Asian American literature as its own distinct field, and sort of subcategory of American literature with its own distinct characteristics, just like, say, African American literature or Jewish American literature. So this book, as I said last week, had quite a lot of prefatory and introductory material that went with it before you got to the actual contents of the anthology, and unfortunately, I kind of liked and felt like I got more out of all of the prefatory stuff and the introductions than I did from most of the anthology entries. And I don't know if that's because some of them were excerpted from novels, and so I was missing some kind of context for what was going on. A few of the selections in the anthology are also kind of postmodern and experimental in a way that I don't necessarily always respond to in fiction. It's weird. I really like kind of experimental stuff in poetry, but not necessarily in fiction. I don't know why. So maybe that was also part of it. I did like several of the entries in the actual anthology, though, including there was Act 1 of a play by Momoko Iko called The Cold Gold Watch, which I quite liked. That was about a Japanese family of farmers, basically like right when the bombing, or right before and right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor happens. And I only got to read Act 1 in here, but I imagine Act 2 is kind of like how their lives shift after the bombing of Pearl Harbor occurs. Another one that I quite liked was Toshio Mori's short story, The Woman Who Makes Swell Donuts. I thought this was a great story. I liked it so much that I added Mori's collection, Yokohama, California, to my TBR. I also quite liked the last two stories, Hisei Yamamoto's Yoneko's Earthquake and Wakako Yamauchi's And the Soul Shall Dance. Hopefully I didn't butcher either of those, but who knows. Cousin from Always Doing, if you're watching, you can tell me if I butchered those or not. So anyway, so I ended up, because out of the 14 anthologized entries here, I really only liked about 4 or 5 of them. But I did really feel like I liked and got a lot out of the introductions, the preface, the preface to the 1974 and 1991 editions of this book, and then the introductory material about Chinese and Japanese American literature and Filipino American literature. So that, coupled with the fact that I did like, about 4 or 5 of the anthology entries, I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. And I would recommend it because, just because I don't like something doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to like something. And I do feel like this anthology has a little bit of something for every reader. It doesn't have any poetry, but it does have, like I said, a lot of nonfiction stuff about the history of Asian American literature, and also about the history of this anthology, which I found quite fascinating. It has some excerpts from novels, it has some standalone short stories, and it also has Act 1 of a couple of plays. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this if you want some kind of introduction to Asian American literature as a whole, especially if you're more interested in how it developed over the first half to about mid-20th century, then I would recommend this. So 3.5 stars. So that is everything that I finished this week in terms of what I am currently reading. As soon as I finished Aiiieeeee, I decided to pick up Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown. So I have read the first chapter, or Act 1, if you will, of this, because it's set up like a screenplay. So I'm not very far in, I'm only 35 pages, but I am enjoying this so far. And I find it easy and comical to read, although it has also been poignant as well. So I'm liking this so far. So both this and Aiiieeeee were choices that I made for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which is happening the entire month of May in the United States. So still reading this. I am also reading with Lindsay of Lindsay's Book Life, The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. I'm reading this as an ebook, so I don't have it here to hold up. So we have already read the first 2 stories and checked in about those yesterday, and I think we both quite liked those first 2 stories so far, so that's going well. I also started reading Pirkei Avot, or Chapters of the Fathers. commentary by Samson Raphael Hirsch, but I think it's actually translated by a woman, which is interesting and exciting. Rendered into English by Gertrude Hirschler. So, yes. So this is a Talmudic Jewish text that basically is set up in the format of, it gives you a line from the actual book of Pirkei Avot that will say something like, you know, Rabbi Gamliel taught that, and then it'll say whatever, you know, whatever the line or two was that he taught, and then it will have a sort of commentary below the page on what Samson Raphael Hirsch said about that. So it's sort of like expounding upon whatever the actual line is. So here is, I'm only 20 pages into this. I'm trying to take this quite slow because it's a little complicated to read because I read the English of the actual Pirkei Avot over here. Then I like to compare it against the Hebrew because sometimes the translations are a little different. I mean, and I don't always know what all of the Hebrew words are, so I can't do that all the time. But, you know, sometimes you find some interesting translation choices. And then on, you know, down here is the actual rabbinic commentary. So there was one I wanted to read. So this one is talking about Rabbi Hillel. So it says, he used to say, he who seeks a name loses his name. He who does not increase his knowledge decreases it. He who does not study is deserving of death. He who makes improper use of the crown of the Torah will pass away. And then at the explanation it says, a good name that endures must come unsought. It will come only to him who performs good and commendable deeds and acts of helpfulness for no other motive but out of his sense of duty without caring what others may think. As for him who is greedy for honor and fame, who is motivated in his actions solely by the ambition to acquire a name for himself, his fellow men will soon discover that he is prompted by selfish motives alone. Besides, his gluttony for fame and honors will quickly lead him also to reprehensible conduct, and then whatever good reputation he may have gained at the outset will vanish apace, etc., etc. So I've read one chapter of this, and I'm 20 pages in. It's like a pretty slim volume. It's only about 100, it's fewer than 120 pages, but like I said, I am reading it quite slowly, one, so that I can, you know, kind of take everything in, and two, because I read the English, then I read the Hebrew, then I read the commentary, so it's you don't read it quite like you would just like read a regular book. So this was one of my two picks for maybe Midrash, which is going on this month. This is hosted by Steve Donoghue, Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and a couple of other people. And then the other book that I am going to read for maybe Midrash, but I have not yet started, is Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, but I haven't started that yet, like I said. And then the other book that I'm still currently reading is Ralph Waldo Emerson's Essential Writings. I'm doing this as a buddy read with Karen Evans, and this is going to be an ongoing project because it's quite a long book, so I'm not going to mention this every week that I do my Friday Reads video. Maybe occasionally if I, you know, we finish something that's like really good and I want to mention it. But I did finish Nature, so that was good. So Nature was part of my Springathon reading, which was for the first 2 weeks of May, and then the other thing that I read for Springathon was A.R. Ammon's poetry collection Garbage, which I talked about last week, and that was for the Bloom Decay prompt. So that is everything that I either finished this week or I'm currently reading. If you have thoughts about any of these books, I would love to hear that. Please feel free to let me know that down in the comments below. Thank you for watching this. I hope everyone is staying healthy and well. I hope you're doing good reading whatever you're reading, and until next time, would it kill you to call you mother?